Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Barnett, and welcome to Supply Chain Pain, How Contractors Can Get Relief from a Supply Chain Related Claim. I'm counsel here at PilieroMazza, where I focus on government contracts. I help lead our contract claims and REA team, where I help contractors prepare, negotiate, and litigate the full spectrum of claims, REAs, terminations. I also help contractors on a variety of compliance issues, bid protests, and everything else a full service government contract attorney handles. Beyond that, I have particular specialties in the Freedom of Information Act and the attorney-client privilege. PilieroMazza is more than, although it is more than just a government contracts boutique. We're a full service strategic partner for government contractors and commercial businesses alike. Specializing in government contracts, litigation and employment, corporate and business transactions, and litigation. We strive to be effective partners for all commercial businesses. Today, we're here to talk about supply chain related claims. It's one of the topics that I might talk about 2 to 3 times a day, every week, where companies are finding that their supply chains are either producing longer lead times, material unavailability, higher prices, changing prices. And contractors are frequently asking me, how can I make this right? How can I make up that time? How can I make up those costs? And I'm going to give you an overview of what you can do to better prepare yourself to recover those costs, and what you can do in situations where those situations have already occurred, and what avenues you have to recover. So I don't need to tell any of you what the headlines look like these days. Supply chain shortages, long lead times, bottlenecks, inflation at a 13-year high. And these are, not getting any better. This is affecting all areas of the United States economy and certainly impacting government contractors. We've seen a dramatic increase in quotes post-award. Even as little as 30 or 60 days later, quotes are going up by 50, 100%. I've had contractors come to me to tell me that after placing an order and have it in the queue, they're being told that there are new shipping fees and handling fees being tacked on to previous orders, or orders are just being canceled because there are material shortages. And the lead times that were quoted as 2 weeks, 5 weeks are now 20 weeks, 30 weeks. Reports, DOD is reporting that companies are skittish to enter into long-term contracts because of the uncertain economic outlook. All of these have direct consequences for the contractor. And there are 2 principal ways that contractors are seeking, or 2 principal issues that all of these factors are conspiring to cause. There's a decrease in the profitability of contracts, and there's an increase in the time it's taking to perform contracts. Next slide. Which is resulting in contractors looking for claims for more money and claims for more time. So let's talk about that first issue. The claims for more money are primarily associated with price escalation or inflation. Initially, this was a result of COVID-19 related disruptions to the labor force and supply chain. As things were more difficult to obtain, price went up. This has been exacerbated in the recent months with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its resulting uncertainty and related sanctions. And the results of both these causes, and some would argue the cures the government has implemented to counter them, have resulted in the highest levels of inflation in a decade. That's rising gas prices, rising food prices, rising commodity prices, oil, steel, cement, rising wages, labor. All of these are conspiring to make jobs much less profitable and driving costs significantly higher. The government is not, ignorant to this fact. Agencies have recently acknowledged the problems that government contractors are facing as a result of the inflation. In March, GSA issued an acquisition letter explicitly recognizing that various factors continue to impact the global economy, leading to general shortages and delays, as well as price volatility. In response, GSA issued a acquisition letter that suspended some of the restrictions on the standard GSA schedule price escalation, economic price escalation clauses, allowing GSA schedule contractors to increase their pricing. In May, earlier this month, DoD issued a response to some questions from Congress. Those responses confirmed that DoD was indeed closely monitoring inflation. It made two other interesting claims. It pointed out that most current fixed price contracts do not have an economic price adjustment clause. Only about 5% of contracts do. And that DoD has not seen many requests for an equitable adjustment for inflation on contracts, either with or without an economic price adjustment clause. And it also noted that vendors may seek to recoup losses from previous fixed price contracts in future bids. So I think both of those comments are a little bit ominous, and we're going to get into those in a little bit. Just the idea that DoD has not seen an influx of REAs tells me that maybe us as advisors to contractors are not doing a good enough job informing contractors of their rights to seek those adjustments, or are being too conservative, that because those types of REAs, as we're going to discuss in a moment, are not airtight 100% certainties, that contractors are hesitating to file them. It sounds like that DoD is in part using the idea that there is not an influx, as Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks termed it, of those types of requests, as maybe an excuse that they don't need to do anything at this moment. Exactly how the inflation or price escalation is going to affect a government contractor depends largely on the type of contract at issue. As one of my mentors, Herb Fenster, always said, the first thing a good government contracts attorney should do is read the contract. And that is certainly true here, as it is in most situations. For contractors with fixed price contracts, those risks of increased prices are generally borne by the contractor. According to the FAR, a firm fixed price contract provides for a price that is not subject to any adjustment on the basis of the contractor's cost experience. This contract type places upon the contractor, quote, maximum risk and full responsibility for all costs. Now, there is an exception, and that is for fixed price contracts that contain economic price adjustment clauses, or EPAs. And FAR 16.203-2 goes into some of these. Hold up, let's go back, please. Goes into some of these clauses, but in essence, it allows the contractor to seek a price adjustment for certain contingencies that are spelled out. Costs go up, price of commodities rise, certain inflationary benchmarks are met. For customers with cost type contracts, that's where the government bears the risk of cost increases. Those contracts still are impacted by the price escalation or inflation. First, a contractor is going to reach the contract ceiling or contract estimated amount much more quickly with escalating prices. In addition, the contractor's costs, although the risk is borne by the government, the contractor must still ensure that those costs are reasonable. So we have a question here. If I can pull it up. On fixed price contracts without an EPA clause, companies are being told, force majeure, and are given, are being given excusable delays, but not being compensated. And that kind of is stealing my thunder a little bit, because that is going to be a point that we're going to make a little bit later. But in general, the government has been very willing to work with companies throughout COVID to provide schedule adjustments, but not cost adjustments. We'll get into that a little bit more. Finally, so one thing we can do is what kind of strategies are contractors using pre-contract award to mitigate against price escalation? I think it's very important that contractors monitor the pricing during the bidding phase. That includes getting quotes from your subcontractors and having those quotes be valid for as long as possible. We all know that the bidding process can drag on, and with protests, it can drag on even more. So to the extent practicable, ensuring consistent prices from your supply chain and monitoring how those prices and quotes are doing throughout the bidding process is an important step. Second, build risk into your proposed prices. As we saw the comments from DoD to Congress, they're anticipating that in this period of volatility, companies will incorporate additional risk and prices will go up if companies have to bear the risk of the increased prices. With that said, I think you should be clear in whether it's your negotiation memos or your discussions that the increased costs, or the increased price rather, is due to the increased risk. Also, during that pre-award phase, ask the question or request the contracting officer include a economic price adjustment clause or a contingency to cover price escalations. According to the FAR, economic price adjustment clauses are appropriate when the circumstances, when there's, quote, serious doubt concerning the stability of market or labor conditions that will exist during an extended period of contract performance. DoD, in their letter to Congress, is admitting that they're anticipating, significant inflation over the next several years, including through fiscal year 2023. And point out that if you don't receive an economic price adjustment, that contingencies would otherwise have to be included in the contract price. And it is somewhat of a difficult situation because price is so sensitive, and competitions are so coming down to price so often. So it's easy for me to say you should raise your price and to account for this risk if your competitors are not raising their prices to do the same. But it really comes down to a business decision of how to price that risk, or a business development position of how to convince the government that it's going to get a better price if it assumes the risk of those costs with an economic price adjustment clause. Another important pre-award consideration is to ensure that your subcontractor and supplier quotes do not contain escalation terms. If those are not similarly reflected in your prime contract. And related to this is consider how fixed those subcontractor and supplier quotes are. I've counseled, I was involved in one matter where we were trying to get recovery from the government because we obtained a quote. The government issued a notice to proceed. The following day, the contractor obtained a quote for key building supplies. The next day, they signed up, they executed the agreement for that quote. And over the preceding 6 months, as delivery continued to be delayed for this proprietary, but necessary product, the company kept increasing the price. And because of the way the contract was written or the agreement was written, there was nothing that the contractor could do, or little that the contractor could do. So securing those prices from your downstream supply chain is an important consideration as well. And as I mentioned before, limiting the length of time your bid prices are valid. Again, this isn't something that's easier said than done. I know the government is constantly pressuring contractors to, keep the bid price valid for another 30 days, 60 days, another couple months because of the bid protest. But you need to look at this as a business risk. No matter how big the contract is, it's not worth performing if you're going to perform it at a loss. So just keep an idea of what prices look like as you're continuing to exercise the bid. Post-award strategies become a little more difficult. Next slide, please. Once again, the first thing you should do is have a strong understanding of what contract clauses are in your contract. If it contains an economic price adjustment clause, if it contains, other clauses that permit adjustments if there's changes in laws or changes such as the taxes clause. In addition, there are a number of clauses that have been recently added or that are routinely updated that may be in your contract related to labor rates, your Service Contract Act wage determinations, or the new federal minimum wage. As these are added to the contract, be sure that you are properly requesting the contract price to be adjusted. Really, any opportunity that you have to adjust the contract price is a chance to chip away at the effects of price escalation. You also may want to consider the timing of your material purchases. Possibly accelerate those purchases so that you can lock in better pricing. Purchase supplies early and store off-site if necessary and if that's feasible cost-wise. Unfortunately, we're going to talk a little bit later. The government has been very critical of companies that have been looking to change their contract if they didn't do everything above and beyond reasonable to secure pricing. We're going to talk about that in a moment, but we should be taking steps to really appear as proactive as possible to secure subcontractor pricing. Finally, and this is probably the area where I spend most time counseling customers, counseling contractors rather. Closely scrutinize any government direction for potential changes or delays. As we all know, if the government changes the contract, then the contractor is entitled to compensation for that change, which could include, in some cases, price escalation. I imagine, there's a sound argument that if the government direction delayed the contractor's ability to purchase some supplies for 3, 6, 9 months, a year, and the price of those supplies has now gone up, I think there's an argument there, a strong argument there for price escalation. But it all ties back to that government direction and tying the cost of that delay to the government. And the changes clause requires prompt notice. It requires authority. So it can't just be anybody in the government. It has to be somebody at the contracting officer level who has the authority to bind the government. But those are, hooks where you can find, different ways to get at the problem of how do we get more money out of this contract, aside from, the economic price adjustment clause that, is the easy fix for this problem. But as DoD mentioned, only exists in 5% of the contracts. So there are also some traps to trying to insulate your contract from price escalation. I think timing is everything sometimes, and on one hand you have DoD telling the federal government, or telling Congress rather, that they anticipate contractors are going to start increasing their prices to make up for losses under prior firm fixed price contracts. At the same time, the Sixth Circuit just came out with what I would regard as a terrible False Claims Act opinion in US XREL USN4U versus Wolf Creek Federal Services, where the court held that a contractor could face FCA liability for submitting intentionally false and inflated project estimates. There are a lot of issues with this decision, but on its face, saying that you can't submit inflated project estimates is problematic, especially when I just told you a few slides ago that you should incorporate additional risk. But that's also why I mentioned a few slides ago that you should document that the reason that you are increasing your project estimates for a firm fixed price contract is to account for this risk. There are other traps, as I mentioned, in a variety of situations where contractors have gone for, requests for equitable adjustment, or submitted claims seeking some kind of relief for the escalating prices. The government has found reasons to reject that higher pricing, pointing to the fact the contractor did not take all reasonable steps. And what they often point to is what I would refer to as well beyond reasonable. Locking up your subcontractors to firm fixed price contracts immediately after contract award, even if they're not going, those supplies aren't going to be needed for several months. It's just not the way business is done, and not really the way most subcontracts are traditionally handled. Relatedly, I think the government, and I haven't seen this yet, but I'm anticipating that when DCA starts auditing some of the costs under cost type contracts during this period of intense inflation, we're going to see some challenges to the reasonableness of the costs because, again, the contractor theoretically waited too long to secure subcontractor pricing. And instead of getting the price in January of 2022, they waited till June and prices were 25% higher. And our friends at DCA are going to claim that that is somehow unreasonable. So I think a lot of the answers here are to document everything, document the market conditions that you're facing as you're seeking pricing, and to take steps early and often and document those steps to secure your supply chain with as fixed prices as is reasonable under the circumstances. So there are a couple of, I call them litigation options, although a lot of this falls somewhat short of litigation. If you do have some type of hook, some contract clause or some government action, or a really good story, and you just want to throw yourself at the mercy of the contracting officer and hope for a reasonable response, you can submit an REA asking for relief under the applicable clauses. An REA generally does not have to be certified unless it's a DOD, and it just explains what types of cost increases you're experiencing and what relief you're looking for. If that is denied, you can also submit a claim. So that'd be if it's above $150,000, a certified claim seeking the increased costs. And this is typically your route if there's a change or if you're arguing there's a government clause delay that somehow increased costs. Also in these interesting. One of the listeners asked, do you foresee any luck in getting accelerated progress payments in order to buy supplies more quickly? I think that would depend, classic lawyer answer there. It would depend on the circumstances, but I think making that ask would be very valuable to documenting your case later on. If you were to ask to purchase, for the accelerated progress payments to purchase supplies and were turned down, I think you would have a good equitable argument later on that the government did not allow you to purchase goods more quickly. And at least that would, give more credibility to the idea that you did everything that was reasonable under the circumstances. Of course, in classic lawyer fashion, I could also imagine the government throwing that back in your face. And saying that since you asked for the accelerated progress payments, you recognize that you needed to purchase these supplies more quickly. But on balance, I think that would be a good idea, and I think contracting officers under the circumstances may be amenable to that kind of request. In addition, I also listed it under litigation options, although it's not purely litigation. Take steps in somewhat adversarial fashion to limit the contract terms. If the price escalation has become too much that you're no longer profiting, hold the government's feet to the fire on enforcement of options. Options must be exercised in strict conformance with the contract. That means there is typically a option notice period somewhere between 30 and 90 days before the option exercise date, and the government has to let you know they're considering exercising the option. And then they have to exercise the option prior to the option exercise date expiring. And if they don't do that, you are not bound by the option extension. For scheduled contractors or individuals who have, a variety of items that they're selling to the government, if you can reduce the number of items available or remove some of them from your schedule, if those items are, the price is offered are not being profitable or you can't change the price, you should do that. And similarly, refuse to agree to bilateral modifications that are not favorable. If the government is asking you to do more or to comply with regulations that are going to cost you money, really take a firm stand that you can't, that they need to include a cost impact before you'll agree to them. I knew, for a short while, the COVID vaccine, I was seeing contractors cancel, or contracting officers rather, cancel contracts if they wouldn't accept that clause in their contract, which for contractors that are having a difficult time with the costs or out of control price inflation, that might be an option. Then if all else fails, there is technically the ability to seek extraordinary contractual relief under Public Law 85804. Next slide. Although there was a number of successful similar inflationary adjustments in the 70s and 80s when these boards were more active, the Public Law 85804 has been used very rarely in recent years, but it does allow broad contractual relief, even when the government has no legal obligation, and even when relief might be otherwise prohibited by law, as long as it facilitates the national defense. This is the ultimate, long shot, but it is one of the arrows in the quiver. In addition to, the current supply chain situation resulting in costs and inflation and escalation, there's the other half part of it where it's also leading to delay in material shortages. Next slide. Again, the causes are very similar. The COVID-19 supply chain disruptions, exacerbated again by the Russian invasion. It doesn't help that large shipping was paused for weeks at a time in the Suez Canal, or boats are just circling, waiting for the opportunity to get into port. As a result, somebody asked if there's a minimum amount to submit a claim if your REA has been denied. No, there is no minimum amount. Claims can be in any size. As a result of the delays in the material shortages, what we're seeing is long lead times, just straight out unavailability of parts, or I think electronics is particularly having this problem. Anyone who's tried to buy a car in the past 2 years knows that because of the shortage of certain microchips and microprocessors, that vehicles have been in short demand. That is the same for a lot of electronics being sold to the government. Microelectronics are just unavailable, or the lead times have, double, triple, quadrupled. As I mentioned before, I've seen dynamic changes occurred after orders were placed. Yes, you'll get this part in 2 weeks. I meant 4 weeks. I meant 8 weeks. I meant 12 weeks. And you end up looking like a fool to your contracting officer as you keep giving him updates, and the updates are going in the wrong direction, and it has nothing to do with anything you've done, but your suppliers are just increasing the lead times. And what does this do? It results in reduced or non-existent profits, and even worse, terminations or reduced quality ratings. I've dealt with a number of companies who have been terminated for default because their contract required them to perform in a certain amount of time, and due to material shortages and long lead items, they were not able to meet that schedule. So from these supply chain delays, we're looking for additional time, additional costs, and, as a defense to the terminations. And I sound a little bit like a broken record here, but the relief available depends in large part on the contract terms. But as we were talking about a little bit earlier, agencies are generally more sympathetic to reasonable claims for an extension of time, without being quite as reasonable or sympathetic to additional costs. In a lot of ways, I feel for the agencies, and I feel for the contracting officers. As we went through COVID, and now we're dealing with, inflation. These are clearly problems outside of the control of the contractor, but since they affect all contractors, it's difficult for the government to pick and choose which contractors it will help. So that I am a little bit sympathetic to their plight, but that still doesn't make it right that contractors are being asked to bear all this risk and bear all of these costs for the federal government, when the federal government's in a much better position to bear them, even if they do apply to everyone. So in your contract, there are going to be a number of clauses. Next slide, please. That outline when you're entitled to excusable delay. These are either in the excusable delay clauses, the termination for default clauses. These Next slide. These contract clauses are typically going to entitle the contractor to relief from the schedule, to additional days to perform, but do not necessarily entitle the contractor to costs. However, while these clauses do rattle off, half a dozen to a dozen specific issues that entitle a contractor to delay, supply chain issues are not listed as one of them. Now, the list is not exhaustive, so just because supply chain does not appear on the list does not mean it's not eligible. However, to obtain an excusable delay, you need to show that one of the causes on the list or some other cause was not the fault of the contractor and was unforeseeable. And when contractors have attempted to make supply chain related arguments in the past, contractors have run into a couple of difficulties. One, they're expected to know their supply chains. They're expected to place timely orders. They're expected to manage their subcontractors. So the courts and boards have used a combination of those three reasons to say that the supply chain issue, the long lead item, the material unavailability was not unforeseeable or was at the contractor's fault because they should have known about their supply chain, or they should have managed their subcontractors better. At the same time, there's a great quote from a case from the late 70s that contractors are not expected to have prophetic insight and to take extraordinary preventative action. Although I will say, despite that very accurate and on-point quote, a lot of the cases I have read have actually required contractors to have prophetic insight and required them to take extraordinary preventive action. So it's a difficult situation. Looking through all these cases in both at the boards and in dealing with contractor officer responses to materials I've submitted, there are a few, cardinal sins or missteps by contractors that the government will jump on to deny any type of relief. If there was no effort to secure supply prior to submitting the bid, or if the contractor knew about the long lead issue or the material unavailable issue at the time of the bid. Relatedly, the failure to order supplies in a timely manner. I've mentioned this a bunch because the government has repeatedly used this to justify refusing to provide any type of relief, is saying, oh, contractor, you should have ordered that product sooner. You wouldn't have these lead time issues if you would have ordered it sooner, or inflation wouldn't have been an issue if you would have ordered it sooner. This very much ignores the idea of what are you going to do with the part when it comes in early? It costs money to store it. It costs money to secure it. But that's, I guess, a little too much next level thinking. Another, key misstep by a lot of contractors seeking this type of relief is that they provided insufficient data about the shortage. I think a lot of these successful board cases, just by reading the opinion, you get the sense that the contractor went in there and marshaled inordinate amounts of data from industry groups and other contractors and subcontractors, government organizations, just pointing to the existence of these shortages and the causes of the shortages. And I think that's the type of information that really needs to be shown. It's not enough just to walk in there and say, oh, look, inflation's really high this month. So there are a few other significant contractual provisions that can be used to assist with supply chain issues and long lead issues. Next slide. I think you went one too far. Okay, go to slide 22, please. So when making these, supply chain related delay claims, I think it's really important to detail the market conditions. Also notify the CO throughout the process. Keep them up to date about, I've ordered these supplies. This is the lead time I'm being quoted. These are the delays I'm seeing. These are the price escalations. It's also helpful if you can try and link your supply chain delays to other covered events. To the extent you can link it to COVID-19, epidemics are one of the listed events in the excusable delay clause. If you can link it to some even government sovereign acts, the government closed the base. So these are excusable delays. These ripple effects are excusable delays. There was a significant microprocessor plant that had a fire 2 or 3 years ago. as a result, like 30% of the market disappeared. That, you could make the argument, I'd be a little creative, but make the argument that fire, which is covered under the excusable delay clause, led to the supply chain. So I think sometimes it helps contracting officers if you can link some of these theories to the black letter of the clause. So there are a few other contractual provisions that can assist with, next slide, that can assist with the supply chain. Thank you. First, there's the FAR 52-211-15, the Defense Priority and Allocation Requirement, or DPAS. These requirements implement the Defense Production Act. And at a very high level, we could teach a whole course and do a full hour-long webinar on the DPA. But it requires contractors to provide the government preferential treatment to what are called rated orders. But where they can be beneficial is that they entitle the contractor to obtain preferential treatment from its suppliers by assigning those suppliers rated orders. And that means that your order has to go to the front of the line. So to the extent you have a rated order, do not hesitate to use it. I think that's really important. I've seen some contractors who, especially higher tier subs, who don't fully understand the DPAS system and are therefore hesitant to flow it down, or understand it perfectly well but are hesitant to flow it down and spook its lower tier suppliers who may not understand it. But given the importance of those rated orders and the potential for long lead issues that become out of control, I think the DPAS can be a godsend, really. The other helpful clauses that can help with long lead is the changes clause. Again, I talked about this a little bit earlier when we were talking about inflation. Be on the lookout for anything that could be construed as a government change, whether that's direction, instruction, interpretation. It could even be a constructive suspension. It's possible that contracting officers implement changes to the scopes of work, to schedules, to project access, completion milestones due to COVID or due to other issues. And if they do that, and you can point to cost impacts because of it, you can tell them that was a government change and seek additional time under the contract to perform because of those changes or additional costs. In particular, if the government wants to change the material, I think that's a really easy argument to make. Oh, you asked for a new product or a new type of product or a new quantity of product. And as a result, we had to, go to the end of the line, and that lead time is X or 2X, 5X. But you need to be really on top of identifying those changes, because most of the time you have to notify the government within 30 days of those changes. So I apologize, there hasn't been a lot of great news, no magic unicorn way to recover. I do hope that I've given you some tips or some ideas of things to be on the lookout for that can improve your chances of recovering. And just kind of the key takeaways from all of this, negotiate the contracts and your subcontracts with price escalation and long lead risk in mind. It's really going to come back to the terms of the contract, and the more that you have incorporated that risk into the contract clauses and into your price, the better off you're going to be. Also, be aware of notice requirements. Excusable delay has notice requirements. Changes has notice requirements. And even informally, keeping your contracting officer updated about the supply chain impacts. Notice in this case is going to be your friend. It's going to come back and help support whatever arguments you're going to make down the road. And it's also on a personal and practical level going to endear you more to the contracting officer, who isn't going to be blindsided when you tell him that, oh, that piece that we ordered 2 years ago hasn't come in yet. And it's going to make the whole process, well, I won't say it'll make it smooth, but it'll make it smoother. And also document the whole process as it's occurring in real time. Save emails where suppliers are telling you that things are going to be delayed. Include notes to the file when they tell you what the reasons for those delays are going to be. Incorporate, Associated General Contractors had an inflation briefing I was looking at to prepare for this. That's just a great artifact to keep in your files too, when pointing out to the contracting officer later on, trying to document the issues that you had in real time. I have tried to, I've tried to answer the questions as I came through. I will review all the questions that have come in and get back to anyone that I did not have a chance to answer. But I will take additional questions now if anyone has them. I think we have about 5 minutes left. Yes, the slides will be available, and if you don't mind sitting through the painful 60-minute presentation again, I believe it will be posted to YouTube so that you can enjoy the fun that was this experience. There was a question. Good question what the YouTube channel is. I'm not sure, but maybe we could post that in the chat if we have that available. In addition, there was a question. Did I state earlier that EPA clauses are included in GSA supply schedule contracts? Yes, well, sort of. The GSA has its own particular economic price adjustment clause that is in most, if not all, GSA schedule contracts. And it allows the contractor to raise prices a certain amount of times in a certain period. And they have recently suspended some of the harsher requirements of that to make it easier for contractors to raise prices. There is a great blog my colleague John Williams did on the EPA price adjustment changes at GSA that you can Google and look up that. I've seen some specific questions about dining facilities and increased food costs, as well as maintenance contracts and increased gas costs. Again, I think your first line of defense is going to be that economic price adjustment clause. If that's not in there, talking to your CO about the situation, or again, I think both those contracts are ripe for thinking about if there were any government changes. Did the government make any direction about the type of food or what the scope of work was that might affect the amount of driving that occurred that that could serve as the basis for a claim. But that's really getting in the weeds and is very fact specific. Well, I want to thank everyone today for asking such great questions and for joining me during this webinar. And please be in touch and be on the lookout for more content from myself and my colleagues about a variety of issues facing government contractors. And have a great day, everybody.